Hey everyone! Our story for today is Betty the Yeti Plays Hide and Seek by Mandy Marx. Chapter 1. Betty Learns a New Game. Betty Yeti and her family were at their neighborhood park. Betty's friends were there too. Everyone was enjoying the fresh spring air. Well, almost everyone. "I'm bored," said George. "Let's play hide and seek," said Elsie. Cecilia nodded her head. Betty didn't know that game, but it sounded fun. Sometimes she felt shy and wanted to hide. "How do you play?" Betty asked. "You all hide," said Cecilia, "and I won't look. After I count to 20, I'll search for you." Chapter 2. Nowhere to hide. 1, 2, 3, said Cecilia, covering her eyes. Elsie ran behind a recycling bin. George squeezed under a slide. Betty looked around her. She was too tall to stand behind a recycling bin, and she couldn't fit under the slide. 18, 19. Cecilia was almost done counting. Betty ran behind a tree. It was taller than her, but was it wider? Betty tried to make herself tall and straight. It was no use. 20, ready or not, here I come, said Cecilia. Betty heard her friend running toward her. "I found Betty," she said. Betty sighed as Cecilia kept looking. "Elsie, George, where are you?" called Cecilia. Betty couldn't believe she didn't see them, but at last Cecilia found them both. "Now I'm the seeker," said Elsie. She started counting. George got into a tube slide. Cecilia went under some stairs. Betty's heart raced. Elsie counted even faster than Cecilia did. In a panic, Betty ran behind a light pole. Elsie opened her eyes. She burst out laughing. "Betty," she said, "you have to at least try." Betty tried to smile, but the truth was she wasn't having any fun. Chapter 3. One last shot. Next, it was George's turn. Elsie ran behind a bush. Cecilia climbed a tree. For a third time, Betty was stumped. The only place where she could hide was behind another Yeti. Luckily, Eddie was sitting down playing his video game. He didn't notice Betty crouched behind him. Betty was happy she found a good hiding spot. 19, 20, shouted George. "Ready or not, here I come." Just then, Eddie scored in his game. He jumped up and yelled, "Yes!" Betty was now in plain sight. "I see Betty," called George. Betty covered her face with her hands. "That's it," she said. "I'm done." And she ran off crying. Cecilia walked toward Betty, but Eddie put a hand on Cecilia's shoulder. "Let me talk to her," he said. Chapter 4. Betty's Strengths. "Sorry I blew your hiding spot, sis," Eddie said. Betty gave him a little smile. "It's okay," she said. "I'm not very good at this game." "You might not be good at hiding," Eddie said, "but what about seeking?" Betty hadn't thought of that. She could always spot her friends' hiding places. "Use your strengths," said Eddie. "We Yetis may be big, but we're also tall." "That was it," Betty smiled. "I know what my strength is now," she said. Betty went to find Cecilia. "Could I be the seeker this time?" Betty asked Cecilia. "Probably not all the time," said Cecilia, "but you can have my turn now." Cecilia was a good friend. Betty smiled and covered her eyes. 1, 2, 3. Betty's friends ran to new hiding spots. At last, Betty shouted, "Ready or not, here I come." Well, that was a good story. Thanks so much for joining us. See you next time.